Not judging a product for what it is, rather for what it isn't. There, I said it. But for a more in-depth look, I'm a critic, as you know, and I'd like to think I do a pretty decent job at it, and there are a few things I do to make sure that I always come across as at least competent. I always try to make sure to avoid contradiction or hypocrisy with everything I've said previously, although that is pretty hard to do, but more than anything, I try to avoid the single biggest problem with criticism in my eyes. I've talked extensively about my disdain for the argument of it's different and therefore ruined, but this goes deeper than that. It's a problem that so many critics, even the biggest critics out there, fall for. Next time you watch a video review, watch for a variation of "it doesn't reach my arbitrary expectations of what this thing should be and therefore it's bad." It's something that plagues criticism culture and it drives me up the fucking wall. Alright, get your salt shakers ready, cause I'm about to call some people out who are way more famous, successful, and better looking than I am or can ever hope to be. I think the most famous example of this mentality would be the eternally dead horse Egoraptor's sequelitis on Ocarina of Time. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Egoraptor made some good points, and I respect the fact that he was able to articulate his opinions about why he didn't like that game, which is more than I can say about most people who don't like it. But so much of his criticism can be boiled down to it's not a link to the past, which is his idea of what Zelda should be. And if you're judging something based off of completely arbitrary criteria that isn't even close to what the media you're criticizing is going for because it's what you expect, then it's never going to measure up to your expectations, because then you're just setting impossible to reach goals, because these are two completely different pieces of media. Now, I've met Egoraptor at a meet and greet before, and he comes across as a nice guy, and I've been an on and off fan of Game Grumps for a while now, and generally have nothing but good things to say, but I don't much care for him as a critic because of reasons like this. So much of what he says is just X isn't like Y, and therefore it's bad, without even talking about what X does right or wrong, only that it isn't like Y. His former co-host JonTron is no stranger to this either. I discussed before how my opposition for his rationale behind hating Star Fox Adventure actually partially inspired the concept behind Unnostalgic Reviews, and it bears repeating that so much of that review was spent complaining that it's not Star Fox, it's not my idea of what Star Fox should be, and that never sat right with me. And on that note, I don't think I've ever seen a single review of SFA that wasn't complete ASS, because all people have to say is, it's not Star Fox, it's not what Star Fox should be, and that makes it bad. It's Zelda, it's not Star Fox. To which I respond, okay, then how is it as a Zelda game then? Nobody judges it for what it is, only for what it isn't, and I see this all the time. The way I see it, every game should be judged in a vacuum, and while it's fine to compare a game to its forebears, I don't think it's okay to judge it against its forebears, because that diminishes something's value as a singular entity, and as such just gives it unfair arbitrary standards that it simply can't reach, especially when it's going for something unlike its predecessors. I see this a lot when people comment on my Dawn of the Dragon review. While not a perfect game, and there are perfectly legitimate things to complain about, every complaint I see can be boiled down to it's not like the Insomniac Games trilogy. Ever thought it's not trying to be? Everything should be judged on its own merits, but that's something that people seem to not be able to do. I guess when it comes to something like storytelling, it shouldn't be necessarily judged in a vacuum, because then it might be contradicting something from the previous installments, and in the case of when you compare it to the previous installments, it doesn't make any sense or directly contradicts things. I guess that's fine, but in a lot of cases, I just see people saying it's not like the previous games and therefore it's bad, without any legitimate legs on that argument. Like, yeah, if it makes no sense because of its forebears, then that's something that's completely fair to criticize, but if it's just it's different and therefore it's bad, then that's not a fair criticism. Everything should be judged on its own merits, but that's something people just seem to not be able to do. Separate themselves from their biases and see how something stands on its own. You could argue that I've done this before, but it's something I try to avoid. Take Crash Bash, for example. While I briefly brought up the other games, especially in the story analysis, I made sure to not say that it fails because it's not like the other games. With or without Crash 1 through Team Racing, I still think the Crash Bash story falls flat on its face, and with or without the previous games, it's still only a slightly above average party game. I bring up the comparison, but that still doesn't play into my critique of the game. There was one part where I was talking ill of Rillaroot, but that was more so talking about the philosophy behind party games rather than complaining that it wasn't what I wanted/expected. Granted, to backtrack a bit, I do think that JonTron's Nuts and Bolts review went for the same thing that his Star Fox Adventures review went for, and it had more merit because there was some deceiving advertising going on, and there were some legitimate complaints, like how they changed the core gameplay but kept the same level design, and that made sense, so it was much more valid, but there was still a distinct air of this isn't my idea of what Banjo-Kazooie is, and therefore it's bad. Not heavily, but it was there. Also, let's not kid ourselves, Banjo-Kazooie was never subtle for a minute. I think another egregious example of somebody hating on something because it didn't match his expectations of what it should be would be one of my favorite YouTubers, NerdCubed, and his opinions of Saints Row 4 and Gat Outta Hell. Especially his original video on Saints Row 4. That was unbearable. That entire video just screamed, this isn't what I want Saints Row to be. Granted, there were some legitimate complaints to be had, like how they reused the same sandbox map from Saints Row the Third, but so much of that video was spent in a perpetual complaint cycle that struck me as him having reached the conclusion that he didn't think this is what Saints Row 4 should have been, and started finding nitpicks to justify his opinions rather than starting with all the individual pieces of evidence and drawing an unbiased conclusion from there. I'm not saying he doesn't have a right to his own opinion, because he absolutely does, but when I listen to what he says about Saints Row 4, I can't help but think he didn't even give it a chance because it wasn't what he expected and isn't his idea of what Saints Row should be. Because in a vacuum, both Saints Row 2 and 4 are fantastic. I like 2 more, but 4 is great, certainly better than 3, and hell, someone close to me went into Saints Row 4 completely fresh without any preset bias and without playing the other games and loved it. And honestly, you can watch his Gat Outta Hell video and legitimately play a drinking game of whenever he says, I remember when this used to be a game about gangsters. General reception from the community can also be tainted by expectation. Can we all agree that Mighty No. 9 was merely mediocre? Yeah, the behind the scenes portion was about as mismanaged as mid-90s Sega. Yeah, that's a good comparison. As mid-90s Sega, but the end result was just meh. But so many people jumped on the hate wagon because of everything that happened behind the scenes, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The amount of things I've seen where people have just decided something sucks because of some arbitrary reason that any sane critic would look at and say, that doesn't mean shit, is ridiculous. In fact, this might explain why the Sonic fanbase has been known to be so toxic, because the fanbase is split into 3: retro fans, adventure fans, and boost fans. So because the fanbase is so perpetually split, you literally can't please any more than 1/3 of the fanbase at any given time, because they all have some different idea of what Sonic should be. But if you think that's bad, you haven't seen the internet wrestling community. Here's the thing. I've had a shaky history with the IWC, as I've been attacked by them on more than one occasion, but the one thing that never ceases to chive my spuds is the IWC's almost determined level to complain about things that have no bearing on anything that's happening on screen. A good example was back when there was that big story about Kurt Angle having a big potential career-ending secret be revealed. It was a bit of an underwhelming reveal that he had an illegitimate son, but before the day was even over, nobody even gave it a chance because it was the accepted theory that it was a story about an affair with Kurt Angle's former boss, Dixie Carter. But anybody with half a brain knew that that was never gonna happen. Dixie Carter was never going to appear on WWE TV, but this is what everybody thought was gonna happen, and this is what everybody had already decided was going to happen. But the moment the reveal happened, nobody cared or even gave a chance to what the real reveal was. Rather, just bitched that the reveal wasn't what everybody said it was going to be, and people actually got mad at me for insisting that we give this a chance before tossing judgment. But no, it wasn't what everybody expected, and therefore it's awful. You see, this is why when it comes to wrestling, the only people I watch are Steven Larson's Going in Raw, because they make it a point to always look at the glass half full and only judge something for what it is rather than what it isn't, and I find that insanely appealing. Actual optimism instead of the IWC standard of the arbitrary pessimism based on expectations not being met. I used to watch a certain internet wrestling commentator back in the day. In fact, for a while, this guy was the biggest wrestling commentator before people like What Culture, the aforementioned Going in Raw podcast, Wrestling with Regret, and countless podcasts from people in the business. And I watched this guy for a very long time, who I won't mention because he's still small enough that he might actually care what I say. Eventually, I had to stop watching him because after a while, he just started doing nothing but complain about what the shows weren't, but almost never talked about how the shows were. Just acting like he was the smartest person ever and knew exactly what it should have been, and didn't even bother judging it for what it was, and he just became completely unpleasable, and it was just so irritating. But talk about split. You think the Sonic franchise is split? The wrestling community has its purists, the old school fans, Attitude Era fans, high-flying fans, hardcore fans, Mat Wrestling fans, NJPW fans, TNA fans, and the list goes on with so many subcategories that you literally cannot please anyone because they all have arbitrary expectations of what wrestling should be, and it sucks. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a game or a sport. I judge something for what's put in front of me and nothing else. If we start comparing things to other things and say it's bad because arbitrary comparison X, where does it end? Black Panther's not a good superhero movie because it doesn't have as much action as the other Marvel movies. Ghostbusters 2016 is better than the original because the original had bad action scenes. Fucking Citizen Kane is bad because it doesn't have enough line dancing. That's where we end up. You know, some people may hate him because he comes across as overly cynical, but I think Yahtzee Crowshaw's Zero Punctuation is one of the best review shows on the internet because while he rarely talks about the positives of a game, he has recommended a ton of games, and he always makes it a point to expose himself to as little of a game as possible before release and go into it with no preset expectation, and you get a lot of really good raw opinion untainted by preset bias, and I think a lot of people can learn from that. So if you yourself are a critic and you're writing a review and feel the need to criticize a game because of how it differs from the previous installments, just stop and ask yourself, does this legitimately harm the game overall, or am I just complaining because it doesn't meet my expectations of what it should be? Because if all your criticisms are valid, make sense, and don't come across as overly personal, or because it doesn't arbitrarily meet your expectations, your opinions will come across as infinitely less whiny and infinitely more legitimate. I'll admit, this has been more of a rant than any serious video, but this is something I've had a problem with for a very long time, and I just needed to put it out there, because I feel like this is bias and hypocrisy at its finest, and we should at least as critics try to not let our opinions be tainted by outside sources. It's a problem that we need to have fixed. Tell me why I'm wrong in the comment section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. TGX over, out, and I'll see you next time.